Hello and welcome to another episode of Nakoto Building Arts. I'm your host, Nakoto, and today I'd like to welcome a very special guest to the podcast, Deborah Frieden. She is the founder of Deborah Frieden Associates based in San Francisco, California. They are arts and cultural planning consulting firm assisting organizations and municipalities with expanding the impact of arts and culture in their communities, with a focus on planning new museums, cultural centers, and district-wide initiatives. Some of her notable projects, there's a plethora of them, but some of her notable projects include the Arkansas Arts Center renovation and expansion in Little Rock, Arkansas, the DeYoung Museum in San Francisco, California, the Joslyn Art Museum expansion and renovation in Omaha, Nebraska, and the new Memphis Brooks Museum of Art in Memphis, Tennessee. She is a Loeb Fellow at Harvard University Graduate School of Design. She was awarded this fellowship in 2006 in recognition for her work in San Francisco. She's also a regular speaker at universities, professional organizations, and conferences, and sits on juries, architectural selections, panels, and advisory councils. Deborah, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Nakoto. It's great to be here. I think this podcast is a great idea.
Thank you. And she's also someone that I've gotten to know and a little bit over the last couple of years with some of those projects I mentioned with the been working in my cost consulting work on the Arkansas Arts Center, the Joslyn Art Museum, and Memphis Brooks Museum of Art. So Deborah, I think I first met you originally on the Joslyn when we did a presentation for that project. So how have you been in San Francisco, California?
Good. I actually live in Oakland, although I've worked in San Francisco more than I have in Oakland. But yeah, I've been here since college, really. And it's good. You know, I think you asked me about what it was like during COVID, and it's been pretty okay for me. I know it hasn't been that way for everyone. But business is steady, and it changed a lot because of travel, not so many speaking engagements, that kind of thing. But you know, people are really looking to the future, which is great.
Yeah. As far as health-wise, so we, my wife and I, my whole house, we did get COVID in you know, when we originally started the whole when everything, you know, kicked off, I guess 2020. And so part of the first couple of months, we did get hit with it. First started with I have two sons, my oldest son, then my youngest son, then me, then my wife. So it kind of swept through our house, but thankfully it didn't last long for us, over a week. So that's great. Did it affect you health-wise in any way, or
I haven't gotten it.
I think awesome.
We in California have been a lot more careful than other places around the country. So I've been lucky, I guess.
I'm in Florida, so we have our differences.
We shouldn't go there.
No, we won't. So yeah, this, you know, as I talked to you before, the whole podcast is to talk to the people who are responsible for the buildings that we see, you know, the museums, the wonderful museums and cultural facilities. And you're one of those people that are on the front end of the whole process and, you know, making it happen, you know. So that's one of the reasons I really wanted to speak with you. As I said, you know, we have worked with you on a few of the projects and hopefully more in the future. And have gotten the opportunity to see some of your work, but not really knowing the full depths of what you do and how you relate with the client and where you fit into the whole building process to make these buildings come about. So So before we get to that, I just wanted to back up and say, back up into find out, where you originated. Were you always in the San Francisco area? I think you alluded to it earlier.
I moved
And
here.
how did you get into it?
Yeah, I moved here for college and fell
Okay.
in love with it and stayed.
Mhm.
And I got into this work by being what we all might call a traditional project manager
Okay.
for in the private sector, sort of smaller scale projects. I do not have an architecture or engineering background,
Mhm.
but I do have really strong organizational skills.
Mhm.
Um, and I got into this work project managing two museum projects here in San Francisco. You mentioned one of them, the DeYoung Museum, which was
Okay.
a major 300,000 square foot brand new building, and the renovation and expansion of the Legion of Honor, which is a National Historic Monument.
Mhm.
And those two projects, as you also mentioned, led me to the Loeb Fellowship Program. And it was coming out of that year at the Graduate School of Design that really gave me the confidence to start my consulting firm. And
Mhm.
what I think is interesting about what I do really stemmed from the fact that when I did both the DeYoung and the Legion, and as project director, I was actually a staff member, not an outside consultant.
Oh, okay.
And
Mhm.
I was senior staff, so I sat in on all the decision making at the highest levels of the institution, except for uh, acquisitions of
Mhm.
specific objects. So I learned from the bottom to the top all of the factors that affect a museum's operations, which
Mhm.
is unique for project managers, right, who come from very different fields.
Mhm.
So when I started my consulting practice, I did so because I realized that nonprofits are typically incredibly inexperienced at
Mhm.
planning capital projects. They don't have internal staff typically that have any experience with it. And they tend to think that architects are going to do everything for them. So a lot of the calls I get are, you probably know this,
Yes.
are,
Yes.
you help, we think we need to expand. Can
Mhm.
can you help us hire an architect? And I'll say, well, really, are you ready? Let's talk about where you're at. And
Mhm.
so I realized that the pre-development planning for these institutions was incredibly important because they don't have the resources to waste. And
Mhm.
they're raising money from private individuals who expect a high level of performance and efficiency in the running of their projects. So that's how I came to
Mhm.
focusing on the very front end. And
Mhm.
so they often have no idea how much money they can raise. They
Mhm.
often know that they need more space, and they might even have an idea of what kind of space, but not really how to calculate how much,
Mhm.
um, how to put some very clear goals out there that can be used to seek consultants and the architectural team that's needed for a project. So I try to help them have a realistic view of what it takes and how much time it's going to take and where they're going to really need key help, and not hiring an architect or other experts until they're really clear about what they're going to do.
Is that like the I guess the the ideal, the main the thought in some of these organizations not really knowing the ins and outs of the whole building process? That's like the first thing. Oh, I need to get an architect on board right now. I need to hire a contractor to come help me do this. So you kind of put them in the right mind frame to do it properly to have a successful project.
Right.
So,
Usually
and
what
you,
we do is we go
mm,
through, sometimes it's a very focused strategic planning session
mm,
around the facilities. Sometimes it's building on a strategic plan that they've already done that identifies the facility as holding them back with their
mm,
programming. and we try to develop a set of really clear goals for the institution. And then we do a programming session where we link space to those goals. And then we do rough budgeting. As you probably know, I call you all the time
We're one of the associates.
Quickie, big per square foot. What are we looking at? You know, just so that I can say to them, you have a $50 million project, $100 million, whatever. Are you even close to able to hire that much? If not, we need to do some really serious thinking about what you're doing. And also, you know, what is it going to achieve in your community? Like, what can you offer the community that you can't offer now? Some facilities are so in need of deferred maintenance that drives the project. But does that mean you need more space? And can you pay for it on an annual operating basis once you get it? So I try to work them through all of those kind of questions. And I always talk about it like a three-legged stool. There is the project itself and defining what that is, the long-term operating needs of the institution, and the community that they serve and how that sort of interrelates. Like, how many people are you going to need to run this kind of programming? And then the third piece is the financial capacity. Like, what can you raise? I'm not a expert on fundraising, but I've been through capital campaigns now for almost 20, probably 20, maybe more museum projects, and maybe, you know, another dozen of different arts organizations. So I know a lot about that interlinkage of that and when they have to have a clear sense of what they can raise.
Now, you've been doing that. You started business, what was it, 25, 30 years ago? 30 years ago, was it?
So I started my consulting practice in 2007.
2007. Okay.
But I've been doing museum project management for longer than I'd like to admit.
So you have the experience to do this. And one of the questions I would have is, so as far as you being hired to do this, to work for these organizations, do you advertise for that, or how do they find you in the whole process?
It's all word of mouth.
All word of mouth.
I've never advertised or had to market myself. I think maybe in the first few years, I, you know, did a lot more speaking. I don't know that it ever actually got me work. I mean, I can't think of a project I have that came out of a speaking engagement, but I think it's a way to get your name sort of percolating out there. So, you know, that was helpful in the early days.
Did you, when you were starting the company, did you look at the landscape and say, I know you mentioned that it was a need in the market, but did you look at other competitors, like, oh, what are they doing? What is this other company doing? Or was that not even a really concern for you?
So having, you know, worked within two museums for 15 years, I knew museum consultants and project, you know, colleagues, let's say, who were doing similar projects. And so and speaking at conferences had, you know, put me in touch with a lot of folks. So I had a pretty clear idea that there were very few organizations nationally or internationally who could really focus on the front end. There are a couple, but very few of them have ever actually worked inside an institution on a major capital project, right? They come to it from the consulting side. So it's a pretty niche thing. And I really decided it somewhat accidentally in a way. So I'm coming back from Cambridge to my home on the West Coast, and I'm getting all these calls from people museum directors who knew me because of the De Young Museum saying they have projects. And I'm like, okay, well, where are you? And within
Mm.
6 months to a year, I realized that just from the calls I was getting, that directors were struggling with how to get started.
Mm.
And most project managers come in once there's a project, and I'm
Right.
coming in long before there's really even a project, as my father used
Mhm.
to say, before the baby is in the oven.
Right, right,
You know,
right.
it's
Yeah.
something that clients need. And I really think this probably goes beyond museums
Hmm.
and arts organizations who should be focusing much more on that front end.
Hmm.
Nakoto, on some of the projects we've worked
Right,
together, how having a decent budget and at least a somewhat of an understanding of what a project schedule looks like
right.
and what kind of architects are the right
Hmm.
firm for a project makes all the difference in the world to the success going forward, right?
Definitely, definitely. And you're part of that process as far as being the ear to the decision makers of that organization in selecting a cost consulting, an architect, all the, a project manager to carry the project forward. So you're part of that whole process to make that happen.
Yeah.
Uh, One question and I think I know, but as far as you start the project, but do you ever go through the entire project with the client, or do you hand it off at a certain point?
I always hand it off. Um,
Hmm.
since I started my consulting practice, I have so the DeYoung and the Legion, those projects, I was the project manager all the way through. Since I started the consulting practice, I typically leave after concept design.
Hmm.
And a lot of um, people might think, well, why concept? You can easily hire a project manager before concept, and there might be some project managers who would argue that is a better scenario. But what happens with my clients is I know the organization so well,
Hmm.
and I've gone through the programming phase with them so intensely that,
Hmm.
and the selection of the architects. And I have the trust of the board and the director and the senior staff so that the concept design, which is so critical to the fundraising piece, as well as the
Hmm.
long-term success of the whole project, um, they usually ask me to stay um, because of that consistency. And sometimes we overlap a little bit. A project manager will come in before concept and we overlap through concept. But I think it's best if it's a clean handoff and the
Hmm.
project manager isn't having somebody who seems like they're looking over their shoulder.
Right,
So
right,
that's the way it's worked on almost all the projects.
right.
Um, I did stay until construction document phase for
Hmm.
the East Palo Alto Art Center there, which is a community art center.
Hmm.
Um, and that was very specific because I had also been doing community engagement and had the trust of people in the community. So I agreed to
Hmm.
stay a lot longer.
Hmm.
Um, and it was one of those projects where you had a lead architect who was going to stay through the whole thing. They weren't passing it off to a local, which is often the
Hmm.
case in many of the bigger projects. So they
Hmm.
were able to provide that sort of consistency. And the project manager I hired for that project was also a cost estimating firm. So they were doing all the cost estimating so they could transition in later with ease and there wasn't a big, gap.
Okay. Now, with because you're involved with the selection and selecting the architects more specifically, what are some of the things that you look for in deciding, because deciding which architect you're going to use? I think of Arkansas Arts or Memphis Museum, and you see a lot of the architect or big name architect, Studio Gangs or Herzog, Demirans, and a lot of the other competitors out there. How do you find the ones that are the best fit for your team and your project? Mm-hmm.
So, it's not that straightforward, but I think I start with what architects have inspired the director.
Mm-hmm.
Like, when they go to other museums, what do they think is successful? And we start compiling a list of those folks. I always try to get minority firms on the list, women-owned firms, although that's less of a challenge than it was. And it was really hard. And then we look at, and those tend to be bigger names that the director had some experience with. And then we try to look at local firms to see if there's anyone who has had any experience in the arts and culture arena. And this is a sticky question for architects, but for example, when we hired Studio Gang for Arkansas Art Center, they had not done that, but they had shown an interest in arts and culture. They had done a small theater. They had done a conservation center. They had done an archive. So they had had these component pieces that gave the institution confidence that they could do the bigger museum project. Most of my clients, particularly the larger ones, want to work with the firm that has museum experience, and I think it's the right decision. So what I tell younger firms or firms who would like to work in the museum field, you need to try to put those component pieces together. You need to show an interest in arts and culture and working for nonprofits. So that's another thing, is having nonprofit experience, because the decision making of a nonprofit arts organization is so different, and the different constituents and the different stakeholders who weigh in on the project. A firm who has not done that, who has only worked for private development, whose sole focus is on the bottom line, don't understand a mission-driven environment. So I always tell firms, get some of that, even if it's small. It can be a small local community arts center. It doesn't have to be a major museum, but get that experience, and that'll go a long way to getting you on those lists.
Okay, that's good information.
I also want to say that I recommend usually a RFQ or an RFP process for my clients, because first of all, they don't want to spend a lot of money on an upfront programming document that gets handed off. And they want to work really closely with architects. So a good example is the Brooks in Memphis, where Herzog's experience with museums is so significant that they are in a position to challenge some of the assumptions of the client around how much space they want, what kind of an auditorium. Maybe they should try something that's a little different. So that's the other benefit of having some of these museum experienced architects on your list or your selection process. But the selection is always made by the board. There's always a committee of the board that makes that decision. I don't make that decision. I just help them through the process and guide them and share my knowledge of the firms. But in the end, they make that decision.
Okay. Helpful information. I don't know, it sounds like some technical difficulty. Are you hearing any feedback from me, or are you hearing a bit? Okay, all right.
No, you look good. You went black for a second, but the whole thing kind of faded out for a moment, but right back. Yeah.
Technology here. Yes. But that's great information. I just want to go into some of the projects that you worked on. We just mentioned a few of them. And if I can share my screen here, I wanted to just show the people some of the projects that you have been a part of creating. Share screen. So this is the Jocelyn Art Museum that you're, Snowetta, I worked on this as well. You hired us as
Yes.
well to work on the costing of this. A nice project. So this is the existing building, and we did some renovation and the new expansion there.
Right. Yeah.
With that is a pretty nice building. So as far as this, with working with the director there, so they would get in contact with you, and you came and then helped them get the project underway. Is that how it works? The executive director will call you?
Right. Yeah, the executive director, Jack Becker, reached out to me. I can't remember how he heard of me, but he was in the fortunate position of being given a major contemporary art collection from a local collector that was very large and quite significant. And the building behind the new edition, the Norman Foster 1994 edition, was where they were showing all their contemporary art. And it was really just one suite of galleries. So they knew that they needed to expand. And they had real challenging aspects with the 1930s building. The galleries were spectacular and pretty pristine, but the lower level that had all the offices and education spaces was really outdated and wasn't supporting the current operations. So the brief he gave me was, I need more galleries and we need to solve some of these other problems. So we went through that exercise I described, where we clearly articulated what those goals were, what the needs were. We developed a space program together. And then we used that space program to establish a preliminary budget and a schedule, which were both used to hire the architects. And we did a RFP process with a fairly good sized group of firms competing. And Snowetta was selected by the building committee or of the board. And that project moved pretty smoothly, I would say, through concept design. When I helped the institution hire their project managers and venue to do the cost estimating. And I stayed through concept, and then the project manager took over at the beginning of schematic design. And I believe they're going to open next year, which is really exciting. Their fundraising has gone well. Omaha is a small town, but the Jocelyn really has no competition. It's really the only major museum in town, so they've gotten a lot of support. And the town has been very open to the architecture and the sort of creativity of this design.
One thing I noticed when I went to your website and to look at some of these projects you have, a long list of projects, that they're all built or either under construction. And, sometimes you go to websites of some of the architects, or, it's projects that have never been built, and it seems like your projects are doing something right, where it's moving in the right direction to actually get built. Here's another Arkansas Arts Museum, Fine Arts with Studio Gang. So I believe this just opened recently.
If it is, I actually don't know if it's fully open, but they may be in the opening process. I know folks who are there currently visiting. Yeah, I think the bulk of my projects have happened. There have only been a couple that didn't. I hope not through my anything I had to. And usually the reason they don't happen is fundraising capacity at the board, and they enter in, with a vision, and they have difficulty executing that vision once they get realistic about the costs. And those projects may happen. COVID has hurt organizations a lot. So I, with the exception of really one project, I think there's still a possibility that some that are unbuilt might happen in the future.
Yeah, I think you just mentioned the COVID and all the inflationary issues that we've been dealing with, as you well know. Is that the main challenge that you would say? Because I'm sure in doing this, you come upon different conflicts in trying to get these projects off the ground. Is besides inflation, are there any other items or issues that you have to deal with?
Well, the first one is always unrealistic expectations by the board. And what I mean by that is they support the director's vision, or they collectively have a great vision. But when you tell them, that you're in the $1,000 to $1,500 a square foot cost range, and plus soft costs, plus escalations for a project that's going to be 6 years out, that sticker shock is hard for them to take. And the conflicts occur when they don't believe it.
Know about that.
Or there's, a disconnect in the board with those who believe they can raise it and those who don't. And so that's usually the first sort of conflict, I would say. And then the second one is when the estimator comes on and really puts that number, and it looks at, and this is usually during concept, it's not a complete estimate, but it's a conceptual estimate. That number is better than whatever I can sort of help them craft early on. Then it's, okay, do we cut program? Do we, cheapen the building? And those conflicts are sometimes really hard, especially if they're in an inflationary environment where in just the 6 months of pre-planning, certain costs on, through the roof, or you have a small market. I mean, I think that's been an interesting thing. So like the Jocelyn had not had as many struggles with labor as other markets, but I think we're expecting that may be a problem in Memphis or some of the other places I work. Or like I'm working in Charlotte. Charlotte is building so many commercial buildings that all the workforce is tied to those. So, a small museum project may struggle, to bring in top talent. So those are the early conflicts that you typically run into in that sort of early development phase, I suppose. And as well as I do, the later stage. Cost is everything.
We're used to giving the bad news sometimes, the rough news, or the sobering news. Like we can work through it. Yeah.
You're really good at that, Nakoto. You have a good, calm way of delivering really, really bad news. That's why you've worked with me so much.
Well, thank you for that compliment. So just the last couple questions is I was thinking about museums, because you've been in it for, like you say, 20, 25 plus years. The future of museums, are you seeing a positive future? It seems like a lot of schools, a lot of cities are really investing in the cultural arts. which is a good thing, I think. Do you foresee that continuing in the near future?
I do. I mean, we can't crystal ball anything, right?
Mm-hmm.
But first of all, I think at the local level,
Mm-hmm.
city government officials understand the role that culture plays in their economics,
Mm-hmm.
as well as the education opportunities for their citizens. So even in diverse politically diverse cities,
Mm-hmm.
um, there tends to be an understanding about how museums can drive cultural tourism. They create jobs, they're spin-off economic value.
Mm-hmm.
So I think in the sort of basics,
Mm-hmm.
museums will continue to do well. We lost a lot of small museums during COVID, and
Mm-hmm.
it'll be interesting, and I don't know whether any of them will resurface after this inflationary period. But I think, the future for museums is really started. I mean, it's been going on for a while, but I think it's really been significant in the last few years. And that is rethinking how they function and confronting systemic injustice in their
Mm-hmm.
organizations or even in their collections or how they display their collections. So they've been dealing with this for a long time, but obviously the events of recent years has even made this more of a demand. So
Mm-hmm.
for them move more quickly than they had been, even though they may have been working on it previously. And I don't know what that'll look like when we're done.
Mm-hmm.
But I also don't think that technology is going to become that radically different for the museums, at least not for foreseeable future. Many of them, you probably know this, were bit pretty badly when they invested in the newest technology
Right.
only to find out it was obsolete or the public was bored with it within a year. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and technology investments can often be quite expensive. So I think technology will be used a lot for interpretation, enhancing background narrative and stories. But I think what museums offer that people don't get and is in other places is that real experience, right? Of
Mm-hmm.
you confronting an object
Mm-hmm.
and the kind of emotional, intellectual experience that you have as someone who, you know, gets to see the original object.
Mm-hmm.
I, the all of these experiential art
Right.
things that are
Mm-hmm.
now, they call themselves museums. They're not museums. They are art. They are digital art experiences where they use the art of a real person and they manipulate it to create an experience. Not that they aren't enjoyable, but they aren't the same thing as confronting a
Mm-hmm.
Van Gogh museum.
Right.
I
Right.
mean, a Van Gogh painting in a museum than one that has been manipulated and projected on the walls and so on. So I don't see a lot of that. I think some museums are experimenting with really interesting uses of forms of that. So let's say you're doing an exhibition on Machu Picchu, but being able to go into a room with a projection of what that standing in that place might feel like. So that sort of enhances your experience of the art objects to teach you a little bit more culturally. And I think certainly history museums and science museums will continue to do more with technology. But again, it's a very risky investment for museums.
Yeah. I was just up in Atlanta a couple of weeks ago and had an opportunity to see some of the museums there and what they're doing up there. So it's pretty nice. It's good to be in this industry. So really, the last question I have for you. Oh, what were you
Oh,
gonna
I
say?
was just going to ask if you saw anything really interesting happening that you struck you.
Well, they're doing some expansions. I worked on the civil rights and human rights museum up there, and to see they're doing a expansion for their human rights portion of it. So it's a new project that's going to be coming out of the ground pretty soon. Not working on it, but worked on the original. So so it is always good to see. Many of the projects that I'm on the front end with the cost. So sometimes I don't always get an opportunity to see the built product. So going, yeah, going back to see some of the projects you worked on several in Atlanta. So I had an opportunity to see the finished product. So that was always nice. The last question I have for you before I let you go, there's not a clear, just thinking about how you got into this field, it doesn't seem like just a clear path to get into what you do. If someone wants to they're looking at this video and say, how can I love what she does, how can I become a consultant like you? Is there a pathway, or what would you suggest?
I think there is. It may not be a straight line as you
Yeah,
suggest,
yeah,
as
yeah.
I might hope. So I think it depends on where you're starting from. If you're already in the project management field, I think there's one path. If you're interested in the arts and education piece, I think that's another path. And what I guess I would recommend for project managers is to really try to hustle for those arts and culture projects, even if they're small. Capitalize on those relationships, support them maybe beyond your fee, in aspects of the planning that you wouldn't normally do, and develop those relationships. It's kind of like I talked about with the architects. You need to show an interest in the museum world, the arts and culture world, in order to move yourself into it. And it doesn't take all that much. I would also recommend taking courses on board management, the functioning of boards, fundraising for nonprofits, because that's the aspect that regular project managers may not ever have to even touch or deal with in their current roles. And I think if you're coming at it from sort of the arts and culture, I would maybe take some courses in museum management, which there are some graduate programs that do a pretty good job. I don't know that you have to get a degree in it, but I think having some background in that would help you move into a position where you could start to think about the building process and how the sort of operations and the building function together.
Okay, great information. Deborah, thank you for this conversation. It's been such a pleasure to speak with you face to face. Well, Zoom face to face. One day we'll be able to connect again in person.
New terminology for Zoom face.
Yeah, Zoom face. There you go. So I really appreciate it. So
it was fun. I appreciate all the support you've given me through the years, because you've been really a brick in terms of helping advise. So great.
And like I told you before, thank you for the opportunity to be on the projects that I've worked on. It's given me a lot more experience in that. So having people in position like you to give opportunity, we talk about diversity and inclusion into this whole cultural arts world, many times you don't see it a lot. So I'm glad to be a part of this whole industry as well. So, and that's partly due to your influence as well. So I appreciate that. How can anyone get in contact with you if they need to, if they want to reach out to you? Do they go to your website? Is that the best?
Yeah, my website, or email me at deborah.frieden@gmail.com.
Okay. again, thank you again. And thank you for watching another episode of Dakota Building Arts, and have a great day. Thank you.
Bye.